Keir Starmer looked directly at the Royal Guard and said it. "So what exactly do you guard against these days? Pigeons or tourists?" He thought he was being clever. What he didn't realise was who he was talking to, a Coldstream guard who'd seen 4 combat tours and never once broken protocol. And when the guard finally spoke back, it left the entire forecourt dead silent and exposed the Prime Minister in a way nobody saw coming. Want to see exactly how it unfolded? First, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. You know that particular kind of London morning where the sky hangs so low and grey you feel like you could reach up and touch the clouds with your fingertips? That's exactly what it was like outside Buckingham Palace as the morning drizzle finally stopped, leaving the ancient stones dark with moisture and reflecting the weak light like scattered mirrors. The forecourt was quieter than usual. Maybe 30 tourists huddled behind the barriers instead of the usual crowds, most of them clutching phones and hoping for something worth posting. A few kids pressed their faces against the rope line, breath fogging in the cool air, while their parents whispered about protocol and tradition in voices that automatically dropped to respectful murmurs. At the centre of it all stood Corporal Ross Kellen, absolutely motionless. And when I say motionless, I mean the kind of stillness that makes you hold your own breath just watching it. His crimson tunic was pressed so sharp you could probably cut paper on the creases. Gold buttons lined up like perfect soldiers themselves, and his ceremonial rifle rested at precisely the angle they drilled into him during weeks of training that most people would never survive. From a distance, Ross looked like every other guard. The same bearskin hat, the same perfect posture, the same 1,000-yard stare that tourists love to photograph. But if you knew what to look for, there were subtle differences. The way he held his left shoulder, just slightly higher than regulation, a compensation for shrapnel that army doctors had never quite managed to remove completely. The tiny scar above his right eyebrow that disappeared under the shadow of his hat. The calloused hands that gripped his rifle with the muscle memory of someone who'd held weapons in places where missing a detail could mean death. But Ross wasn't just another face under a bearskin hat. At 29, he'd already served 4 tours. Afghanistan twice, Syria once, and a classified deployment somewhere in Eastern Europe that his family still didn't know the details about. He'd been recommended for commendation 3 times and turned down 2 ceremony medals because, in his words, "I didn't do it for the recognition." His first tour in Afghanistan, he'd been 22 and scared, trying not to show it. By his second deployment, he was the one watching the new kids, teaching them how to sleep through mortar fire. In Syria, he'd learned something different. How to stand perfectly still while chaos erupted around him. How to maintain focus when politicians back home were changing the rules faster than field commanders could adapt. How to protect people who'd never know his name while taking orders from people who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. His father, a bus driver from Cardiff, had taught him something that stuck. "Son, real strength doesn't announce itself. It just stands." His dad had driven the same route for 23 years, dealing with drunk passengers and angry commuters and city council budget cuts that never quite eliminated his job, but made it harder every year. Never complained, never raised his voice. Just showed up every day and did the work. Ross had inherited that quiet determination, but the army had forged it into something harder, something that could endure things his father had never imagined. And Ross had been standing, through mortar fire in Kandahar, through protest lines in London, through politicians and protesters and tourists who thought his silence meant weakness. He'd learned to find that distant point on the horizon and lock onto it, letting everything else fade into background noise. Today was about to test that silence in a way he'd never experienced. Because rolling through those massive wrought iron gates came a convoy that had everyone's attention. 2 black Range Rovers with windows tinted darker than sunglasses, followed by a battered press van and a Mercedes full of aides whose nervous energy was visible even from a distance. The kind of motorcade that makes tourists stop mid-selfie and wonder who's important enough to rate that level of security. Prime Minister Keir Starmer emerged from the lead vehicle like a man who owned the place. Now you have to understand, this wasn't a scheduled visit. This was damage control disguised as diplomacy. Starmer's approval ratings had been in free fall for weeks, ever since 49 of his own MPs had essentially told him to stuff his welfare reform bill where the sun doesn't shine. The bill would have slashed billions from disability and veteran support, and when the backlash got too hot, he'd walked it back with all the grace of a man stepping on a rake. But politicians don't just disappear when they're in trouble. They find flags to wrap themselves in. And today, that flag was red, gold, and standing perfectly still. Starmer adjusted his navy coat, one of those expensive ones that probably cost more than most people make in a month, and started his walk along the line of guards, with cameras clicking behind him like mechanical applause. His smile was the practiced kind you see in campaign photos, bright but somehow never reaching his eyes. He shook hands with palace staff, nodded to the ceremonial officers, made all the right movements while his press secretary whispered reminders about timing and angles. Everything was choreographed down to the second. 3 minutes here, photo opportunity there, inspiring quote for the evening news. A young woman with a BBC press badge was explaining the scene to her cameraman. Standard political theatre. She'd covered enough of these visits to know the script by heart. But scripts have a way of going sideways when they meet reality. Everything was going according to plan until Starmer reached the end of the line, until he stopped in front of Ross. For a moment, Starmer just studied him, with the calculating gaze of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Ross stared straight ahead, past the Prime Minister, past the cameras, past everything. Fixed on that distant point, guards learned to focus on during hours of training most people couldn't imagine enduring. That's when you could see something shift in Starmer's expression. Not anger, not even annoyance. More like opportunity, like he was looking at a prop that might serve his purposes perfectly. And then he said it, voice just loud enough for the press mics to catch, casual as commenting on the weather. So what exactly do you guard against these days? Pigeons or tourists? The words hit the quiet forecourt like a stone thrown into still water. A few of his aides chuckled, the kind of forced laughter that happens when your boss makes a joke, and your paycheck depends on finding it funny. Someone in the press pool winced visibly. A woman near the barriers muttered something to her husband that sounded like disapproval. But the joke fell flat in a way that even Starmer should have noticed. The laughter died too quickly. The silence that followed felt heavy, uncomfortable. Ross didn't move, didn't blink. Might as well have been carved from the same stone as the palace behind him. Near the barriers, a teenage boy with a school uniform and a military history textbook under his arm turned to his father with confusion written across his face. "Dad, why would he say that? That's not funny." His father, a man in his 40s, wearing a poppy pin on his jacket lapel, didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was carefully controlled. "Some people think disrespect is the same thing as humour, son." Her voice carried when she spoke to her granddaughter. "That guard's been places that man's never dreamed of, and he's being insulted by someone who's never stood still for anything in his life." But Ross remained motionless, professional, disciplined. Even as something cold settled in his chest. The silence stretched just a beat too long. Long enough to become awkward. Long enough for people to start shifting uncomfortably. Long enough for Starmer to realise that his little joke hadn't landed the way he'd intended. That's when he decided to double down. He straightened his lapel with that particular gesture politicians use when they think they're winning, looked around at the cameras to make sure they were catching this, and added with a smirk that definitely didn't reach his eyes, "Strange what taxpayers end up funding, isn't it?" This time nobody laughed. Not the aides, not the press, not the tourists who were starting to realise they might be witnessing something that wasn't supposed to happen. The comment hung in the air like smoke from a gun nobody wanted to admit had been fired, because everyone there understood the implication. Everyone caught the suggestion that somehow all the guards were just expensive window dressing, theatre paid for by people who had real problems to worry about. A ripple of discomfort moved through the small crowd. Phones that had been recording casually were now held steadier, their owners sensing that something significant was happening. The usual tourist chatter had died completely. Because what Starmer didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was who he was actually talking to. Ross Kellen wasn't just a ceremonial decoration. He was the man who'd stayed behind in a blown-out compound in Helmand while his unit evacuated wounded civilians, holding the perimeter for 6 hours while enemy fire picked apart the building around him. The same man who'd crawled through rubble in Syria to retrieve the body of a local interpreter who'd helped British forces, because no one gets left behind. The soldier who'd written letters to families he'd never met, explaining how their sons and brothers had died with honour. He was also the man whose best mate Andy had lost his leg to an IED and was now facing benefit cuts because of the very bill Starmer had tried to push through Parliament. Andy, who'd saved Ross's life by spotting tripwires that would have killed them both. Andy, who now struggled to afford the prosthetic upgrades that let him walk his daughter to school. The same bill that would have left Ross's squad leader, Sergeant Mike Harrison, still dealing with PTSD from 3 tours, without the support payments that kept him housed and fed. Mike, who taught Ross how to lead men in combat. Mike, who still woke up screaming some nights and needed counselling that the government kept threatening to cut. These weren't abstract budget numbers to Ross. They were faces, names, brothers who'd bled beside him and now needed help that politicians wanted to cut for headlines and polling points. But he stayed silent, because that's what guards do. They endure. Starmer started to move on, clearly satisfied with his little performance. His press secretary was already checking her watch, calculating how much time they had left before the next appointment. The photographers were getting their shots. Everything was going according to the plan that had been drawn up in a conference room by people who'd never stood a watch in their lives. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the way the crowd had gone quiet. Not the respectful quiet of ceremony, but the uncomfortable quiet of people witnessing something they didn't like. Maybe it was the way even his own aides looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact and finding sudden interest in their phones. Or maybe it was just that politician's instinct that tells you when a moment hasn't quite landed the way you wanted. He turned back to Ross with that same calculated smirk, the expression of a man who'd spent years in courtrooms and conference rooms where weakness was a luxury no one could afford. "You've been standing here for how long?" he asked, voice carrying enough to reach the press cameras. "Doesn't that get pointless?" The question was meant to be rhetorical. A final jab before moving on to shake hands and pose for photos and pretend this was all about honouring tradition rather than salvaging a career. But Ross had heard enough, and that's when everything changed. Ross didn't move his body, didn't shift his stance or break his ceremonial bearing, but he spoke, voice calm, level, carrying the weight of years spent learning that some things are worth standing for. Better to stand for something than bend for everything. The words hit the forecourt like a physical blow. Starmer blinked, actually blinked, like he couldn't quite process that the silent statue had just spoken, and spoken with more authority than most of his cabinet ministers managed on their best days. Behind the barriers, someone whispered, "Oh my God." A camera phone lowered slowly, the person holding it realizing they might be witnessing something too important for casual recording. Near the press section, the BBC reporter who'd been explaining political theatre to her cameraman suddenly found herself scrambling for her notepad. This wasn't theatre anymore. This was real. Trying to regain control of a moment that was rapidly slipping away from him, Starmer forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Bit dramatic. You guards trained in theatre now." It was meant to be dismissive, a way to reframe the exchange as amusing rather than humiliating. But the words came out wrong, too sharp, too defensive, like a man who'd just realised he was losing an argument he'd thought he was winning. That's when Ross really let him have it. Voice still steady, every word deliberate as a surgeon's cut. "We train for things people in Westminster forget, like accountability." The press section went dead quiet. You could practically hear the collective intake of breath as 20 journalists realised they were witnessing a moment that would define careers. Pens stopped moving. Phones stayed steady. Even the seasoned political reporters who'd seen everything looked stunned, because accountability was exactly what Starmer had been avoiding for weeks. Accountability for a bill that would have devastated the people he claimed to represent. Accountability for walking it back only when the political cost became unbearable. Accountability for showing up here today, trying to wrap himself in tradition while insulting the people who embodied it. Starmer's expression darkened. The practiced smile vanished completely, replaced by something harder. He took a step forward, not threatening, but assertive. The move of a man who'd spent his career expecting deference from people he considered beneath him. "You're out of line," he said, voice sharp, with the kind of authority that works in courtrooms and committee rooms, but carries no weight when you're facing someone who's stood under fire. Ross didn't miss a beat. "So, were 49 of your MPs last week?" If the previous silence had been heavy, this one was crushing. Because everyone there, from the tourists to the press to Starmer's own team, knew exactly what Ross was referring to. The rebellion. The vote that had gutted Starmer's authority and left him scrambling for relevance. The public humiliation that had brought him here today, looking for easy wins and photo opportunities. But Ross wasn't finished. Still standing at perfect attention, eyes still fixed on that distant horizon, he continued with the kind of quiet intensity that makes you lean in to hear every word. They stood against you for gutting disability aid, because some of us actually need it. Some of us earned it. A ripple went through the crowd. Not laughter, not cheers. Something deeper. Recognition. The understanding that they were hearing truth spoken to power in its purest form. Margaret Thompson, the retired army officer near the barriers, felt tears starting to form. She'd never seen a politician called to account like this. "Tell him," she whispered to her granddaughter, "remember this moment. Remember what it looks like when someone speaks truth to power." Starmer's face had gone pale. He glanced around as if looking for support, for someone to rescue him from a conversation that had spun completely out of his control. But his aides had gone silent. The press was watching with the fascination of people witnessing a car crash in slow motion. And Ross wasn't done. "You tried to cut £5.5 billion in support to disabled citizens and veterans, just to chase a talking point. Then, when it backfired, you called it too complex." His voice remained flat, factual, devastating. "That's not leadership. That's cowardice." The words landed like hammer blows, simple, accurate, impossible to refute or spin or explain away. That's when the silence became something else entirely. Not awkward anymore. Not uncomfortable. This was the silence of people witnessing something they'd remember for the rest of their lives. A young mother near the front whispered to her daughter, "Remember this, sweetheart. Remember what it looks like when someone tells the truth because it needs to be said, not because it's easy." From somewhere behind the press line, a voice called out, hesitant but clear. It belonged to a young army officer in dress uniform, maybe 28, who'd been part of the official delegation. Lieutenant James Morrison had been standing quietly with the other military liaisons, trying to stay invisible while his Prime Minister made a fool of himself. "He's right," Morrison said, stepping slightly forward. "My brother's wheelchair grant got frozen because of that bill." The words came out before he could stop them. Morrison immediately looked down, as if shocked by his own boldness. But the truth was already out there. Already adding weight to Ross's accusations. Starmer whipped around, eyes wide with something between surprise and panic. This wasn't supposed to happen. Military personnel were supposed to stay silent, stay neutral, stay out of politics completely. But here was one of his own delegation publicly agreeing with a guard who'd just humiliated him. And then another voice joined in. This one belonged to a man in his 60s wearing a long navy overcoat, walking with a slight limp that spoke of old service and older wounds. Retired Colonel James Whitmore had been passing through the square on his way to the cenotaph, as he did every Tuesday morning for the past 15 years since his retirement. He'd planned to walk past quietly, but the sound of truth being spoken had stopped him in his tracks. He stepped forward slowly, but with complete authority. "That man," he said, nodding toward Ross, "doesn't speak unless it matters." Every camera turned, every eye followed. Whitmore continued, his voice carrying the weight of years spent in rooms where decisions got made that changed lives. "He's done 4 overseas tours, never missed a rotation, filed 0 complaints, turned down 2 ceremony medals because he said he was just doing his job. The colonel had served with men like Ross, had commanded them, fought beside them, watched them come home, changed or not come home at all. He'd spent decades watching politicians use their service as props while cutting their support when the cameras weren't rolling. Starmer tried to interrupt. "I don't think this is the time," but Whitmore raised his hand with the kind of authority that doesn't require rank or title. "No, Prime Minister, you made it the time. The moment you walked onto this parade ground, thinking you could lecture duty to someone who's lived it." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They cut through the air with surgical precision, leaving no room for argument or deflection. From the press pool, a veteran BBC correspondent mouthed to her cameraman, "Keep rolling, whatever you do, keep rolling." Sarah Mitchell had covered politics for 20 years, had seen prime ministers rise and fall, but she'd never seen one dismantled so completely by someone who hadn't raised his voice or moved from his post. One of Starmer's senior aides was at his elbow now, whispering urgently about exits and damage control and getting ahead of the story. But it was too late for spin. The moment had already crystallized into something that couldn't be managed or massaged or explained away. The aide, a young woman named Claire, who joined Starmer's team fresh from university, was calculating the political cost in real time. The clips would be online within the hour. The headlines would write themselves. The opposition would have a field day, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Starmer stood there, caught between retreat and further humiliation, while the crowd waited to see what he'd do next. And in that waiting, that perfect stillness, someone from the back of the crowd, just loud enough to be heard by everyone, said the words that would become the unofficial headline before the sun set. The guard exposed him, and he never even saw it coming. For a moment that felt like hours. Nobody moved. The Prime Minister stood frozen in the centre of a story he no longer controlled, surrounded by cameras that had stopped being friendly and started being documentary. You could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the desperate search for words that might salvage something from this wreckage. He tried one last time. Voice lower now, almost paternal, he stepped closer to Ross, with the air of a man trying to reclaim authority through proximity. "I came here to honour your tradition," he said, the words sounding rehearsed even as he spoke them, to acknowledge it. It was a prepared line, a press secretary's rescue attempt, the kind of pivot that might work in a committee room or during a television interview where the host could be counted on to move on to the next question. But it fell flat in the heavy air between them. Ross still didn't look at him, still didn't move from that perfect ceremonial stance. When he spoke, his voice was quiet as falling snow and twice as cutting. "You came to photograph it." A pause that seemed to stretch forever. "There's a difference." Even the pigeons went quiet. The distinction was devastating because it was so obviously true. Starmer hadn't come to honour anything. He'd come to use it, to stand next to tradition and hope some of its dignity would rub off on him. To pose with symbols he didn't understand while cutting support for the people who'd earned them. Starmer drew a breath through his nose like a drowning man reaching for air. His aides were already moving now, trying to create an exit that wouldn't look like full retreat. The press pool stayed motionless. They knew better than to interrupt when history was still writing itself. And then Ross gave them the final line, the one that would be quoted in editorials and remembered in pubs and repeated whenever people told stories about the day. A guard reminded a prime minister what service actually meant. No shout, no sermon, just one sentence, quieter than all the rest. "We stand still, so the truth can't be pushed past us." That was it, the ultimate explanation. The reason guards don't move, don't respond to taunts or jokes or provocations, not because they're decorative, not because they're outdated, but because someone needs to hold the line when everyone else is willing to bend. Starmer didn't reply, couldn't reply. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't make it worse. He turned and walked away with quick, tight steps, flanked by aides who'd given up trying to spin the moment. Their silence was its own admission of defeat. Claire, his senior aide, was already on her phone calling the press office, trying to get ahead of the story, but she knew it was hopeless. How do you spin the truth? How do you explain away accountability? How do you manage a moment where your boss's character was exposed in real time? Behind him, Ross returned to full ceremonial posture, as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just delivered the kind of truth that topples governments and changes careers. But something had changed in the forecourt. The tourists weren't just watching anymore. They were participating in something larger than themselves, understanding what they'd witnessed. The crowd began to disperse slowly, but differently than they'd arrived, quieter, more thoughtful, like people leaving church after a sermon that had hit too close to home. A little boy, couldn't have been more than 6, lifted his tiny hand in a salute toward Ross. His mother didn't stop him. Instead, she crouched down and whispered something in his ear that made him nod solemnly. "That soldier stood up for people who can't stand up for themselves," she said. "Remember that? Remember what courage looks like." A woman near the barriers was wiping her eyes with a tissue, trying to be discreet about it. When her husband asked if she was okay, she just said, "That's what my father looked like when he came back from Korea." Like he'd seen things that mattered more than politics. Margaret Thompson walked away slowly, her granddaughter beside her, both of them processing what they'd witnessed. "Gran," the girl asked, "why didn't the soldier move when the Prime Minister was mean to him?" Margaret thought for a moment before answering. Because moving would have meant the Prime Minister won, and some things are too important to let bullies win. The press began packing their equipment, but slowly, like they weren't quite ready to leave the scene of something they knew they'd be talking about for years. Sarah Mitchell, the BBC correspondent, was already crafting her report in her head. She'd covered dozens of political visits, hundreds of photo opportunities. But this was different. This was the moment when performance met reality and reality won. And through it all, Ross stood at his post, silent again, still again, exactly as he'd been trained to do. Because that's what guards do. They hold the line. They remember what matters. And when someone tries to push past the truth, they stand in the way, not with force, but with presence, with the kind of quiet strength that doesn't need to announce itself because it simply is. The forecourt emptied gradually, but the moment lingered like smoke in still air. By evening, the clips would be everywhere. By morning, the headlines would write themselves. And by the end of the week, everyone in Britain would know the name Ross Kellen, though he'd never asked for fame and probably didn't want it. But that's what happens when truth meets power on ground that won't give way. Sometimes the silent ones have the final word, and sometimes that word changes everything. So what do you think? Was Ross out of line, or was this accountability that was long overdue? Should a royal guard stay silent no matter what? Or are there moments when speaking up becomes a duty? And if you were standing in his boots, with cameras rolling and the Prime Minister trying to humiliate you, would you have stayed quiet? Or would you have done exactly what he did? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and conversations like these matter more than you might think. If this moment hit you the way it hit us, if it reminded you that sometimes the most powerful response is simply refusing to be moved, smash that like button. It helps more people see stories like this. Make sure you're subscribed and ring that notification bell so you never miss our daily Royal Guard stories. These moments of quiet courage happen more often than you'd think, and we're here to share every one of them. And if you know someone who still thinks these guards are just for show, someone who could use a reminder about what real strength looks like, share this video with them. Your next story is already waiting on your screen. Click it now, and we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over again. Real power doesn't shout, it doesn't demand, it doesn't break, it just stands. And when it finally speaks, the whole world stops to listen.